where we want to continue is we want to continue with our portion specifically on our growth in our prayer. And I mentioned that we want to talk about being able to discern God's voice. So we're going to talk about something called discernment of spirits. For those that have been at the Sunday Sparks, you've been hearing about this, little pieces here and there about discernment, but want to bring it kind of into a, kind of make those, sometimes when we just have those little pieces here and there, we might forget how it's all connected. So this will begin to make certain connections between different concepts that we've already been learning. So the first workshop we had, we talked about relational prayer as the first. We want prayer in our lives as well as, probably one of the biggest reasons that people may not pray is because you don't feel connected to God. Like, I don't feel like God ever says anything to me, or it feels like it's just a waste of time. So if you don't think God is ever speaking, then there's no reason to do it. All right? So we want make sure that we ourselves are experiencing that, so that if we're trying to share that with others, we can also help them to grow in that as well. So there's all sorts of different methods, that we propose for praying. Like, for example, one of the main methods that we propose for people to pray with regard to when you gather in small groups is praying with the sacred scriptures, using rap or Lectio Divina. Wonderful method of prayer. But behind these methods of prayer should be certain habits that we bring to our prayer. So the first time we talked about, first Ignite workshop, we talked about relational prayer. These 4 habits: to acknowledge, relate, receive, and respond. And you'll find these listed on the back of that handout I just gave you, the spiritual battle tactics. It's right at the bottom. So you don't have to write it all down if you want to make sure you remember what they are. So the first thing is acknowledge. Is basically we're noticing what's going on within us and our thoughts, our feelings, desires that we have. What's going on in my interior life, right? So we want to just pay attention to what's going on. Then the next one is relate. We tell everything to Jesus, right? So just thinking about what's going on in my life in and of itself isn't enough for prayer, but then telling Jesus about those things. It is important that we tell him about what's actually going on. He wants to hear about it. And then receive is, in any kind of conversation, we speak and then we have to listen to the other person, right? So that's what receive is all about. It's about listening for God's voice, and we'll find that discernment of spirits will really help us to do that habit. And then finally, it's respond. What then do we practical actions in response to God. So one of the most difficult parts of this might be the receive part for a lot of people because receive is God's work. So you might be like, wow, see, it's easy for us then, right? Because it's God who's doing that part. We just have to wait for him. And that's why it's hard, because we have to wait on the Lord, and we don't always like to do that, right? We got the next thing that we got to do, and prayer can feel like I'm just wasting time. I have to accomplish all these other things. Where in fact, to wait on the Lord and be quiet in prayer is incredibly practical and will assist us in being able to know how it is that we're supposed to act, the respond portion. So, is there anything that can help us in this? Because it's not always easy to wait and receive from the Lord. As I mentioned, sometimes in prayer we might hear God's voice. Other times it might feel like it's just empty and dry and nothing seems to be happening. And we all go through these kinds of ups and downs in our spiritual life. Some days we're catching fish and other days we're not in our prayer. To use the analogy from Peter and his catch of fish. So is there anything that can help us? Because this is normal for us. Not every time that we go into prayer are we going to immediately hear God's voice. And if we think that we hear God's voice every single time immediately in prayer, then we may or may not be. We may just be ourselves. But there's no shame in that. It's nothing wrong with us if some days are easier and some days are more difficult. But there is something that can help us sort through all of these spiritual experiences in our relationship with the Lord. And one of the great resources that we have comes from St. Ignatius of Loyola, who put together his rules for discernment of spirits. St. Ignatius is actually, he also put together his spiritual exercises, which as Father Cordy is away on his 30-day retreat, that's what the 30 silent day retreat is based on, the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius. And the rules for discernment of spirit are given to us during the first week of the 30-day retreat. So it's for the very beginnings of us. So very, very practical rules to help us to notice what's going on, to name where things are coming from, whether it's coming from God or not, and then to know what to do with it. How do we respond? How do we act based upon that? So I've been going through this with our Sunday Sparks in those short bits, but we're going to kind of bring it all together in a more organized fashion today. So to illustrate what we mean by discernment of spirits, if we can go to the very life of St. Ignatius himself. When he was a young man, he grew up Catholic, but he was more interested in other things, like going off into battle. He became a knight. He was interested in going and the chivalry and honors and knighthood and winning the hand of a maiden and all those things. Those are the things that kind of excited him, worldly things. But things don't always go the way that we hope they will. And while he's in battle, he's injured. His leg is hit by a cannonball. So he was canonized before being canonized. Yes. So, yes. Bad dad jokes early in the morning. No. But while he was recovering from that, there in the hospital, this is when God began to really work on his heart. Right? So he's there in the Catholic hospital, and he's getting bored, and he asks, is there any books around that I can read? And so the only books they had the book of the life of Christ, as well as a book on the lives of the saints. And of course, he's not all that interested in those things. He's like, well, don't you have any nice novels, stories about knighthood and things? These are the things he's interested in. But they didn't have any of that. So, first he doesn't want to read them. He puts it by his bed, and eventually he does begin reading them at times as well. So this kind of goes on a while as he's there recovering. And finally, Ignatius writes, a day of grace comes when his eyes begin to be opened a little. And he begins to notice what's going on within him, within his thoughts, within his desires, within the feelings that he's going through. And he begins to notice patterns and differences in different things that are occurring. He notices that when he is daydreaming about knighthood and chivalry and romance and all that, his heart is excited. He's really drawn to that. It's what is interesting to him. But then when he kind of puts that dreaming aside and his mind goes off to something else, he finds that there's something just kind of missing within. His heart is left discontent and unfulfilled. But then he notices that when he had actually picked up the books about the life of Jesus and the saints and was reading them and was really reflecting upon their stories and being like, could I do that? Could I imitate Jesus? Could I be like the apostles? Could I be like the saints? Once again, he was drawn there. His heart is uplifted, and he notices that when he puts the books aside and he goes off to something else, that remains. There's this kind of contentment and peace that remains within his heart even after that. And so he begins to notice this, and he wonders, why is this? What's going on? What does this mean, this difference that happens in this? And slowly begins to realize that the things that leave him empty are not from God, but the things that are leaving him, content. And there's a kind of happiness and joy behind that. These things are the path that God's leading him on, right? And so this is going to lead him to action. He is going to make a good confession. He's going to start going back to Mass and prayer more, and he begins acts of service towards the poor, and a life of holiness begins, right? And Saint Ignatius, or this story of Saint Ignatius Pope Francis has reflected upon, because Pope Francis is a Jesuit, a son of St. Ignatius. The Jesuits were founded by St. Ignatius after this kind of conversion. And Pope Francis has a whole series of catecheses that he did on discernment of spirit. So you can find his materials online too. But reflecting upon St. Ignatius's story, he said, we notice in his story that the thoughts of the world are attractive at the beginning, but then they lose their luster and they leave emptiness and discontent. Right? That's usually what happens. They look good at first, but they leave us discontent. And then he says, thoughts of God, on contrary, at first have a resistance within us. Right? They're not as appealing. He says, I'm not going to read this boring thing about saints. It was Ignatius's attitude. But when they're welcomed, he says, they bring an unknown peace that lasts for a long time. Right? We can be surprised at what occurs. Maybe we can think of experiencing that within our own life. Pope Francis also says that God uses setbacks and unplanned things, at least unplanned from our point of view, to speak to us. So this is what happens to St. Ignatius. He says there's an apparent randomness in life's events. Everything seems to arise from a banal setback. There were no books about knights, only the lives of the saints. A setback that nevertheless held a possible turning point. Of course, getting hit with the cannonball and being in bed is also a setback too, right? That has a possibility that God can use for that. He says, only after some time would Ignatius realize this, at which point he would devote all of his attention to it. So he says, listen carefully. God works through unplannable events that happen seemingly by chance. By chance this thing happened to me, by chance I met this person, by chance I saw this film. It wasn't planned, but God works through unplannable events and also through setbacks. I was supposed to go on a walk, but I had a problem with my foot and I can't do that. That's a setback. But what is God saying to you? What is life telling us when these kinds of things occur? So, based upon what we've talked about so far, want to take a moment, the next reflection question that we have on the sheet, I ask, we want to apply this same kind of moment of St. Ignatius to ourselves. Have I done this? Have I taken time to pay attention to these kind of interior experiences within my own heart? Have I sought to tell Jesus about those things, to try to listen to his voice even in the midst of maybe the things that didn't draw me at first, or in the midst of setbacks that I may have had? So a lot of these kind of reflection questions are very personal, so we're not going to be sharing them necessarily with one another. So we want these to be moments of honesty with ourselves and really ponder what we've been experiencing. So I'll give us some moments to reflect in silence.